Hey there, CS320 students. So in this recording, we are going to introduce testing the data encapsulation object that you have in your first checkpoint. So we're going to run through the same tutorial that we started with in the Java skills. And so I'm in the Module 3 resources, and if you scroll down, we have this JUnit tutorial. And again, previously we created a school class that it had a name and it had an ID, and we did not do any kind of input validation or any of that at that time when we created it. We just created that class. Now, we are going to perform the tests on this class. So the requirements that we see here is that a name cannot be longer than 10 characters for the school, and that it also cannot be null. Now, let's also be honest here. The name, it would have to have a name, right? So we're also going to require it to have a name. So not only is it not null, but it can't be an empty string. And so we also have a ID attribute for it. Again, same deal. It has to be at least cannot be longer than 10 characters, cannot be null, but again, it has to be there. So we're going to also enforce that you have to have at least one character for that ID. Now, they do offer up a tutorial here, so you can watch this recording here. I've got it kind of queued up here, and they created the school class just like we have before. It's going to have a name and an ID attribute, and then they went ahead and created some test cases. Now, I'm okay with parts of this code here, but we're going to go a little bit further into strengthening these test cases and making sure that you approach this with a test-driven development perspective. They came in here with the idea that the school class was already created, and then you create the test for that. Well, we're going to go with TDD, so that way you can learn how to make sure that you meet every test case and that every line of code that you write is tested. So before we get too far, let's jump into the course announcements. So you will find a project details announcement located in your course. And so the course project is going to have 3 data encapsulation classes. So again, we're going to mimic the data encapsulation class of a school. They, again, have string attributes, so we want to make sure that they meet, that they're not null. They are required. We're going to have a name. We're going to have an ID. The string attributes all have a maximum character limit, so we're going to enforce that. And then again, if there's no specified character limit, then we're going to make it a 1 as we need to actually have them. So for invalid input, we're going to throw illegal argument exceptions. And we're going to include a message that specifies the error, so something like whatever field it is, ID, name, whatever it is, cannot be null, or it cannot be empty, or it must contain minimum characters, or it cannot exceed maximum characters, so we want to provide a specific message for that. To aid in the testing of these data encapsulation classes, you're going to want to use the following design. We're going to want to provide a constructor that passes all of the arguments to the object. And then we're going to use setter methods inside the class. So when you complete your actual homework, you need to have setters for some of the different attributes. The only attribute you will not have a setter for is going to be the ID, because that is a unique value that should not be changed. You could go with a private setter for that, which is what I have done. We want to handle the validation in those setter methods. So that way we can tightly couple the testing and make sure that we're only testing that particular method. And then we want to have public getters for all of the fields. Again, we're not going to focus on the service class for now, so skip over all those details. We are going to be using JUnit 5, so make sure that the imports are the form org.junit.jupyter. And we're going to always have separate test classes for our data encapsulation object, as well as the service class that is being tested. In each test class, we want the associated tests to be grouped together. So if we're doing something about IDs, we want all of that functionality tested together. And you'll see in the test code that I'm going to put a big comment block, so I know exactly what is being tested. Your test method names should be of the form test whatever functionality you are testing with whatever condition is being tested, and then the expected result. So this makes it, when these tests fail, we can easily read the test case and then understand what went wrong. Oh, by the way, if these were tied to specific tasks, say in Jira or some kind of task management system, we could also put on there the associated work number. So that way we can tie it directly to the requirement. So examples could be something like this. We want to be able to test that the ID is null. So we've got an ID that's null. That should throw an illegal argument exception. Or we have an ID testing it with minimum length. It should be valid. All test cases are independent of each other, and they follow the AAA pattern. So in the AAA pattern, we're going to arrange our information. We're then going to act on our data, and then we're going to assert that what we expect is true. We will not write any test implementations where we expect something to be present based on a different test. So all tests are going to be independent of each other. And then lastly, all of your code should be in a package. We want something like edu.snhu.yourname, and then whatever package you're going to put it in. So again, in the project example for a project, it's going to be tasks. In the tutorial that we'll run, we'll make it something like schools. And then all of your test code should also be in a test source folder, and again, in a associated package. We want these to match up, and then you don't have to worry about imports being handled. Okay, so let's kind of jump back to Eclipse. So previously, we had created a driver to test some functionality about our school. So here is the school class. Again, we already created it. We knew that it had a name, had an ID, and we kind of created it as we needed. This time through, we're going to take a test-driven development approach. So we're going to come up with the implementation of this data encapsulation class as we write the test code. So we're going to go ahead and close these out. We're going to forget that they even exist. And we'll go ahead and create a new Java project. And I'm going to call this school test tutorial. For your homework assignment, I might call it something like, well, let's see, let's get a good name for that. Let's go back to Learning Module 3. And so in here we are, right here. So we're going to start out by just doing a contact class or a contact service. I would just call the project, maybe you just call it Project 1. And that would be just fine for your implementation and homework. So school test tutorial, I'm going to make sure that the module checkbox here is unchecked, and we'll click finish. Okay, so we're going to come in here. So we're going to create our test package. So we're going to go to build path, new source folder, and we're going to call it test. Click finish. And then right-click, new package. We're going to call this edu.snhu.mparker, and I'll just call it schools. That'll be the package name for what we're going to deal with here. And I click finish. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and add a test class to this new class, and we're going to call this test school because that's all it's going to be. Public, and we can leave everything as is there. All right, so let's come in here and let's create our first test. So first thing we're going to do is we'll test the ID attribute. And so we're going to put a nice long comment block in here. And everything about testing an ID is going to go underneath this section. Everything about a name would go underneath this section. Keep that nice and clean. Okay, so let's do the happy path of an ID first. So public void test ID with valid ID. Let's see here. So what's the condition? So if I have a valid ID is, we'll just say successful for now. So we're going to go ahead and stub out this method. We're going to put our @test attribute, and we'll hover over it. We'll let Eclipse handle it. We need to add JUnit 5 to the build path. Great. And so you can see that it's imported the org.junit Jupyter test annotation. So again, we always want the org.junit Jupyter, as this is JUnit 5. Okay, so in test-driven development, we're going to write some test code that fails first. So we always want a failing test before we do any implementation. So let's create a school. We'll call it my test school equals new school. And again, we only write just enough test code for this to fail. So a failing test is actually when something doesn't compile. So we don't have a school, right? So this is a failing test. So if I try to run this, right-click, run as JUnit test, we're going to get that this doesn't work. And so we have a failing test. Well, it doesn't compile. So let's go ahead and create the class school. So we'll come back here. We're going to go to the source package, right-click, new package, edu.snhu.mparker.schools. And let's create the school class in here. So there's the school class, and we click finish. Okay, great. So remember, we only write enough implementation code to make the test pass. This is how test-driven development works. So now I come back here, right-click, run as JUnit test. Okay, great. So I've got a passing test. Again, it's not doing anything, but I have this set up. So now let's come in here and let's provide it an ID. So we'll say that this is the ID 1. And again, it's going to say, I don't know what you're talking about because it's not defined. Well, we can let the IDE create it for us. So let's go ahead and create the constructor school. So we click create it, and oh, look, right here, it created a constructor with a string. So let's go ahead and write the implementation. This dot, what do we say this is? IDs, right? Right? ID, yep. So this dot ID equals ID. We're going to clean this up and make that an ID that gets passed in. And watch this. We can make the IDE create the ID for us. All right, so again, we only write enough code to make this pass. So right-click, run as, JUnit. Okay, great. Again, we're passing, but we haven't actually tested anything. So let's come down here and do a test. So assertions.assert equals, the first is the expected, and then the other one is the actual. So we'll say that we expect to get a 1. And so we do my test school dot get ID. Oh, wait, that attribute doesn't exist yet, does it? This is a failing test. Again, not compiling is a failing test. Great. So let's implement this method. So now we write the test, we write the actual implementation. And so again, I can have the ID kind of help me a little bit there. This needs to return a string, and we're going to return the ID attribute. Great, fantastic. We'll save that. Now we come back here and we right-click, run as JUnit. And oh, fantastic, we have our first actual test case, and we know for sure that it covers everything we need to. So I know for sure that I'm setting the ID here, and I am using this getter right here. Okay, so let's clean this up maybe a little bit. So where we hard-coded in this one, we could have potentially done something like this. I don't need to put private in here. Final ID, maybe we even call it valid ID, string valid ID equals 1. And so we can use this. And now we're guaranteeing that these two values are going to be the same thing. Nothing could have changed them. So right-click, run as JUnit. Fantastic. So we know for sure that the ID that was set is what we have right here. Fantastic. Okay, so let's write another test case. So we know that we have to handle the null value. So let's come in here, public void test ID with null value throws illegal argument exception. Okay, great. So we're just going to kind of model what we did here before. So we're going to create a school. My test school equals new school, and we'll pass in null. Assertions dot assert null is one of our assertions we can use. And oops, sorry, I want to assert that it is a illegal argument. I messed up on that. Assertions dot assert throws and we use a lambda, and we're actually going to clean up what I have up above. I don't need to actually do this right here because, again, we pass a lambda. And I believe I've got to pass in the type first. And assert throws. There we go. So I'm expecting it to throw an illegal argument exception. And again, we're going to pass in a lambda, where we're just going to call the constructor right here. So let's right-click and run. Remember, you only write test code until it fails. And so we have a failing test right here. It's going to tell us what the failure is, that it expected illegal argument exception to be thrown, but nothing was thrown. Well, that's because in the constructor, we don't actually throw the exception. So let's come in here. So in here, we could check if the ID is null and then throw that exception. But remember, if we go back to the announcement, where'd my announcement go? And in the announcement, we want to utilize setters. So we're going to come down here. So we're going to use setters to handle the illegal argument exception. We can throw it in the constructor, but ideally, if we're going to have setters eventually, let's put them in the actual setter where the value gets set. So let's come back to our implementation. And so instead of setting it here, we're going to do a set ID. And again, that doesn't exist, so let's do this, set ID. And we'll create that method. There it is. And this is going to be private. Oops, that was already private for me. Cool. And so here, we're going to say this.id equals ID2. Don't really want to call it ID2, so let's just call it ID. And so let's just make sure that this actually ran our first test case successfully. So let's save it. And again, we know that we're going to fail the second one, but the first one's going to pass. So run as JUnit. Okay, cool. So we still have our valid condition. That still works. And let's come in here and put in our check. So if ID equals null, throw new illegal argument exception, ID cannot be null. Great. Otherwise, we're going to set that ID. All right, so let's come back over here, right-click, run as JUnit, and look, both of our tests are passing. So we've tested that an ID with null value throws an illegal argument exception. Fantastic. Okay, so we also know that it cannot exceed 10 characters, right? So let's come back here to the resources. So it cannot be longer than 10 characters. So let's check that if we have 10 characters, or excuse me, if we have more than 10 characters, that it throws the exception. So we'll come in here, create our test case, public void test ID with more than max characters throws illegal argument exception. All right, so we're going to copy this. And we know that it cannot exceed 10 characters. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, there's 10 characters. One more is not valid. So again, we right-click, run as, JUnit. So this test fails, so we always have a failing test before we actually perform the implementation. So let's go into our setter, and we can add an else if. Else if id.length is greater than, we know it's 10, we're going to throw new illegal argument exception. ID cannot exceed 10 characters. All right, let's go check to see if this works. Right-click, run as, JUnit, and excellent, we have our test case handled right here. So we've checked that creating an ID with a valid ID is successful. We've checked with null value, and we've checked if we exceed the maximum characters. What are some other things that we should test? We should test if there are 10 characters, resulting in a successful result, right? So that's the maximum characters, and this is the minimum characters. So we should probably really change this with min length valid ID, right? That's the minimum length that this can be. So we should check if there are 10 characters. And again, we checked with more than the maximum characters. Let's see here. We also need to check for the empty string. Should test if the string is empty, resulting in an illegal argument exception. So those are definitely some things that we would want to test. I'm going to leave that implementation to you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop this recording. In the next one, we'll talk about adding test for the name attribute.